Hi guys. I'm talking to Russ. He's having some trouble connecting, but I'm helping him get onto the crowdcast.
Okay. Hello everyone here and also on YouTube or whatever platform that you're watching this.
Hi guys. I'm talking to Russ. He's having some trouble connecting, but I'm helping him get onto the crowdcast.
Yep. I just heard Sophie. I'm not sure whether everyone heard that or just it was just me. But anyways, welcome to MRI Together 2022. This is the first session, and we are very excited to start the program. I'll leave it to the moderator from Iran, and let's enjoy this.
Well, yeah, thank you. My name's Ashley Anderson. I'm a software engineer at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So I've been out of the MRI world for a little while, but I'm excited to be back interacting with everyone here. I was a attendee at MRI Together last year, and it was fantastic. So I think this is the first session this year. So just want to welcome everybody here, and thanks to all of our speakers, of course, the organizing committee, and everyone who's come to check out these great talks. I just have a couple bookkeeping things to start off with here. I just want to say that this is being recorded and broadcast live. Transcriptions are available on YouTube or will be available on YouTube. I'm not clear if it's happening, that happens live. And so everyone, I just want to make sure everyone's aware of the code of conduct. And you can check that out, I think, on the MRI Together website. Questions, if you have questions, we would love to have questions during this section. Put them in the Q&A box. So there should be like a tab on the right side. I think you can click on my screen, at least it's on the right. Click Q&A, put your questions in there, and also upvote questions that you see in there. Don't put them in the chat. And I want to we welcome all questions. So, all ideas are welcome. The more participation we get, the better. This is MRI Together after all. And then we'll be choosing questions from there. So, and afterwards, you can hang around in GatherTown and hopefully get some more interaction with speakers or other attendees. Okay, with that, I would like to introduce our first talk, which will be by Shern T from the University of Queensland in Australia. And it's going to be about research software engineering for better science.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try and share my slides, first of all, and see if this works. Okay, testing. I'm just going to scroll through the first few. Cool. So good day, everyone, wherever you may be. My name is Shern T, and I'm a postdoc over at the University of Queensland, as well as a member of the Research Software Engineer Society for Australia and New Zealand. And my talk today is entitled Research Software Engineering for Better Science. I'm not sure if everyone can hear me well, but just give me a shout if the sound quality drops anywhere too, or anything like that. So I'm going to give you an outline of my talk, starting with a very brief definition of what research software engineers are. We are a broad group of people who combine software engineering expertise with an intimate understanding of research to contribute to the academic community. And in the talk today, I'd like to tell you what RSEs actually do, how we do what we do, why we do what we do, and finally, how to show a little bit of love to your RSEs. Now, I'm coming at this talk from a very unconventional background for an MRI conference because I'm not really an MRI person at all. In my daily research, I work on molecular dynamics for complicated systems, so electrolyte electrode systems, as we see in the cover image over here, as well as non-equilibrium flow systems. But I'm here to talk about research software engineering because part of my work is to write the code that I use to run these simulations, which makes me come under the sort of the broad umbrella of research software engineering. And although I've not done any MRI research, I'm sure that, in the MRI field, your research is very dependent on software as well. And I just wanted to start with a little bit of background about how important research software is, not just to the MRI field and not just to my field, but overall. So these are results from a survey that's pretty old now, in 2014, but I would imagine that if you carried out this same survey today, you'd get roughly the same result. In the survey, about 90% of researchers who are asked said that software was important for their research. In fact, 70% said that it was indispensable, that their research actually wouldn't exist without the software packages that they use. And on average, in a random sample of these Nature papers that were looked at, there were about 6.5 different distinct software mentions per paper. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of software. And I've put out some of the logos of software packages that you might be using in your MRI field, and certainly that I use in a day-to-day workflow. So from the top left, we've got the logo for Python. And we often use Python code in an interface like, let's say, the Jupyter Notebook or the Spider IDE, which are the next two logos. We use Anaconda to manage our packages. Not very well, but probably better than the alternatives out there. And then there's the logo for NumPy at the bottom middle, very, very basic package for manipulating numerical sort of data in Python. And the last one there being Bokeh. I would imagine that, although I don't personally use it in my research, in the MRI field, I imagine at least some of you would be using Bokeh for your image manipulation purposes. And this all raises the question, if software is so important to research, who is the one who's actually writing it? Right. And up until a few years ago, there was this big question of who's actually writing the software that researchers use and how are they actually being incentivized for it. And here's a particularly interesting and vital example of this phenomenon from a paper called the AstroPy problem, which was published on Archive in 2016. So here's the first table from that paper. And as you can see, this is a package that at that time, and I imagine still today, was very widely used within the astronomical community to do very basic things like process data, transform coordinates, analyze data. It's been used in national observatories throughout the world. It was used to process data from the Hubble Space Telescope and presumably now from the James Webb Space Telescope as well. And if you can look at this, these statistics in 2016, there were more than 200,000 lines of code in this package alone. And they did a very quick estimate that if you tried to write all this code out, it would take about 56 person-years to get through all of that at an estimated cost of about $8.5 million. But the point of this paper was that at that time, there was actually zero funding whatsoever for AstroPy. The entire package was being developed sort of in spare time, on the side as a freelance project by people who were either using the code themselves or, just had an itch to write code. And this software was being used by the rest of the astronomy community, really without a very clear source of funding for it. And this is a very difficult situation to be in because without funding, how are these researchers going to continue writing this code? Of course, in a postscript, the great news is that these days the AstroPy project is properly funded. They've got a steady stream of grant money coming in from various sources, and so this particular situation has had a happier ending, so to speak. But the general situation of research software is quite similar to what's highlighted in this paper, which is that research software engineers are people who are busy, hard at work, sort of writing the software that we use day to day. And it's worth having a bit of a think about what their role actually is, right? So what do research software engineers do? This is an interesting thing to think about because I imagine that most researchers, even those who don't consider themselves as research software engineers, do write script and do write code from time to time. But the difference, I guess, between sort of an academic who writes code on the side and someone who thinks of themselves more as a research software engineer is that a lot of the effort and sort of attention that we RSEs put into our work revolves around not just making code work, but making code reusable. So packaging code nicely in such a way that anyone can, first of all, download it and install it on their computers. That's not something that we can take for granted, especially on some of the larger sort of computational clusters that are out there. It's important to be able to make sure that different parts of software talk to each other. Sometimes it's important to make sure that software doesn't overlap. There can be many packages that do the same thing, and it's difficult to choose between them. And most of all, as research software engineers, we try and make sure the software that we create comes with clear instructions, comes with a clear history of development. And really, that's a very integral part of making sure that research overall is more reproducible and more accessible. If we can't access and reuse the software that's used to generate research, in a very fundamental sense, we can't actually repeat the research itself. And that's something that really drives most research software engineers. And it's also important to note that we would like recognition for our work, right? Not just because it's a nice thing for us to have, but without recognition, it's very difficult for many of us to stay in the positions that we stay in and keep doing the work that we do. If you go into the mind of an RSE, why do we do what we want to do, right? And sort of what drives us to become academics who focus on code, or coders who focus on academia? Well, a large part of it is that we love a good puzzle. This was certainly the case for me when I started out in my current postdoc position. I didn't have any thoughts that, a couple of years later, I'll be deep in the weeds of compilers and C++ and memory management and all that. But it all started with this simple question of, this particular code doesn't work under this particular circumstance. Can I expand it? And, that led me to where I am today. So if you find yourself obsessing over making code faster, if you obsess over, this code doesn't do this thing, I wonder if it goes in, you'll quite naturally find yourself going down the path of becoming a research software engineer. And not only that, being a research software engineer often involves a lot of collaborating. These days, almost no software packages are written sort of just by one person. Research software is usually written by at least a small team, and often you have to take into account what users need and what users are thinking about when you write software and when you sort of run it. Right. And one of the really nice things about being a research software engineer is that you really get the feeling of helping other people out immediately, because, other academics use the software that we write to do things that they might not be able to do themselves. And let's face it, some of us just like writing method papers, like myself. But I imagine that's probably the least important motivation in this series. And the really interesting thing about being a research software engineer is that right now, at least, it's not really a very formalized career pathway. If you look in a university list of courses, there will be courses about, sort of scientific research, and there'll be courses about computer science. There won't be a course on how to be a research software engineer, right? These are often very hybrid or almost ill-defined sort of roles where you might start out as an academic who's writing a lot of code, and then you find yourself being a research software engineer. Or you might start out as, let's say, a computer science graduate or someone with a master's in computer science, and you find yourself employed at a place which needs you to write research software, right? And in similar ways, research software engineers are often found in a variety of ongoing jobs. You can find us sometimes leading groups or being postdocs. Oftentimes, if you need to find a research software engineer, you can at least look around at your local supercomputing cluster, where a lot of the admins or people who run the cluster will either be, sort of in a research software engineer role themselves, or know someone who does these things. And there are companies which sort of specialize in helping research software engineers to code, coordinating code sprints, networking between industry and coders in academia to try and make the whole process smoother, right? And the purpose of me saying this is to let us know that research software engineers are a very broad category, and you may find that the role that you are in really fits some of this sort of description of bridging a gap between software engineering and between research, right? And these roles are really vital to research, especially to reproducible research, because many of the principles from software engineering are very fruitful when applied to research, such as version control and documentation and things like that. right? But the thing about being an RSE is that there are problems that RSEs face in today's academic climate, right? So the first problem of all is the problem of skill gaps, right? Because this is a very hybrid role and it's a role that's sort of almost in between two worlds. When you become an RSE, you often find that there are things that you don't know that you think that you really need to know in order to fulfill your role adequately. I know that for myself, when I started writing software, I was terrible at it. I didn't know anything, barely anything about C++. I knew very little about how to set up an IDE for manipulating code or making sure that I was able to check my code for bugs. And all of those were things that I had to accumulate over time. And that can be a major barrier for RSEs. But beyond that, once you get past sort of the skill barrier problem, there are also some cultural problems in academia that really affect RSEs. One of the fundamental one being that software is not often considered as a real academic output compared to papers. Right, it's much easier to list the papers that you have written and the number of times they've been cited, at least right now, than to list the software that you've worked on and what you've done to make it work, right? And a lot of the work that goes into especially keeping software up to date, maintaining it, fixing bugs, those aren't really the kinds of contributions that you can capture in an academic paper as it currently exists. Anecdotally, right, it's very difficult. It can be difficult to find community. It can be difficult to find other RSEs who sort of understand some of the unique pressures that you face, because day to day, you might be the only person who codes in your group, or you might even be sort of the main sort of code group in your department. And it's really vital just to know that there are other people out there who are doing very similar things to you and facing very similar challenges and opportunities. And to some extent, these issues are not just issues that are unique to RSEs, but they reflect the need for a broader cultural shift, right? Academia these days is facing up to the reproducibility crisis and, questions of should researchers really focus just on writing more papers, which the answer I think is no, but rather researchers should be focusing on writing papers that are better, that are more easily reproducible, that can be more critically replicated and examined and reapplied. And as academia shifts its focus to that, there will also be a shift in focus to value the kinds of infrastructure and support roles that make it possible, such as the RSE role. So while we are in the middle of that shift, how can we love our RSEs, right? So at the macro level, I think enhancing institutional recognition is really important. At the meso level, it's very good to encourage your RSEs to network, or if you're an RSE, to really get involved in the network where you are. And at the micro level, every researcher who uses code can give back to code development in a few very simple ways. Okay, so the first thing is to enhance institutional recognition. Thankfully, the landscape is changing these days. There are growing opportunities to get grants to maintain software, the Chan Zuckerberg Institute, MOL SSI, software sustainability, and so on. There are really more opportunities these days to try and get some recognition and funding for the very important work of maintaining software. And in this space, one very particular opportunity is that GPUs are being adopted by computing clusters all over the world. And, they represent a really important opportunity for programmers to write software in such a way that it runs more quickly, right? And because of the ways that GPUs are done, they're also more power efficient, running the same kinds of computations. So if you get something working on a GPU, that's a paper, right? Which, we shouldn't be counting papers, but while everyone else is, it's really good to get a paper out that says, I got this working on a GPU, right? And especially where there are some cases where when you get a speed up in software, it goes from almost sort of a quantitative change, like this software runs 2 times faster, to a qualitative change, like there's a particular kind of workflow or a particular kind of diagnostic opportunity, let's say, that becomes possible if software runs at a certain speed or gives you a certain amount of accuracy in your results. And if you're an RSE, or if you're someone who hires an RSE, it's really useful to look out for some of these opportunities to get a paper out and get it cited. Yeah. And one particular area, I think, is recognition by institutions, that is recognition by universities and departments. And in a very recent international survey just this year, one of the really interesting results was that 80% of the RSEs that were surveyed felt valued by their supervisors and fellow researchers, right? So people who actually work with these RSEs are often very keenly aware of how much they do and, the benefits that they bring to science, but only 50% felt valued by their institutions. Often this results, this comes from probably promotion pathways or progress reports not really recognizing the kind of work that software engineers do. And it's really important to tell our stories, right? It's really important to think about your software, if you are an RSE, not just as I solved a wonderful problem of code and I invented a really neat way to shuffle my variables and all that, but at a more broad level, here's a thing that other researchers in my field can do, or are doing much better, that they weren't able to do before the work that I did. At the meso level, it's really important for RSEs to network. Right now, with the internet, with opportunities to organize, it's really important to be able to show up for your fellow RSEs, to get to know them, and just to create this ecosystem and this community of people who do very similar work, face very similar challenges, enjoy very similar opportunities. And one particular purpose of this is to make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel, right? Because as an RSE myself, I know the temptation of running off and just developing my own code instead of looking around to see if I could join up with someone. Right. In fact, just this year, one of my most fruitful projects was collaborating with someone, with a group in Germany who was working on very similar code to me. Because we were working together, we were able to solve the same problem twice as quickly. And it's really important for RSEs to make sure that we spend some time looking around and making sure that we're not just duplicating somebody else's work. Right, so here's a list of research software engineer communities that was pulled off the internet. If you don't have an RSE community where you are, feel free to look at that Research Software Engineers International link to try and link up with international bodies, or even have some ideas about starting an RSE organization where you are. And lastly, at the micro level, if you use code, you have an opportunity to give back to the people who develop that code. The most important, the most basic thing you can do is to cite the codes that you use, right? And not just sort of, the analysis codes that you use. Oftentimes, if you are visualizing an image, there is code there, and it's good practice to try and cite the code that you use. If you're familiar with the field and you recognize that, there are certain codes that are used in every major publication, you can do your part of making sure that other papers in the field also cite the codes that you use, right? This year alone, I've had at least one chance where I saw a just published paper without a citation for a particular method that I'm familiar with. And I emailed the authors of the paper and I said, hey, I'm very curious to know where you got this code from. And once they told me where it was from, I was able to give them the proper citation for it. And that citation was then included into the official version of the paper. So wins all around. Right. And if you're actively using a particular code, think about spending a little bit of time documenting how you've used your code. Write it up as a how-to, or as an example, or as a tutorial. I can tell you that as someone who writes code myself, I've not got the time to actually spend time looking at the script from an end user's perspective and sort of writing up what works, what doesn't work, what to avoid, what are some common errors. Ideally, research software engineers would do this sort of work themselves, but sometimes we're just too deep in the weeds of the code that, we sort of assume that something that makes sense to us will make sense to other people. And it can be a really huge contribution if on your lab page or even on your GitHub, you can write a couple of examples of code that you've used and how it all came together as a script in your research, right? And the last thing is, when you use code, provide feedback. It's really useful for us as developers to know how you're using our code in the wild, what bugs you may have found, what issues you may have found. Any code that has a GitHub repository will have a place where you can register issues, and that's really useful for us as developers. So in summary, To make research better and more reproducible, we need better software. Research software engineers help make that happen. And we can create a better future for research software engineers and better research for that through better institutional recognition, through stronger networks between RSEs, and for people who use research code to contribute back to our code bases by citing them properly, by providing documentation, and by providing feedback. And lastly, I just want to give thanks to the University of Queensland, where I'm employed, the Research Software Engineers of Australia and New Zealand, where I got this speaking opportunity, and where I've had a wonderful community of people, and the ARDC as well, which does the same thing. And finally, the Turing Way, which is a really valuable society in the UK side, for reproducible research. So that's my talk. Any questions?
Awesome, sure. And actually, we're going to hold the questions. There is one already, but I'm going to give people a chance through the next talk to submit them as well. Based on the schedule, we're going to go to 2 talks and then discussion, and then again, 2 more talks and then discussion. But yeah, that was really fantastic. So thank you so much for that. It definitely resonated a lot with me and my sort of career path. But I'm going to move on then to the next one, which is going to be by Yolanda Ohene from the University of Manchester, who will be discussing inclusion and retention for early career researchers.
Oh, can you see my screen okay? I had the age-old problem of being on mute there.
Everything looks good.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to speak in this this wonderful MRI Together conference. And so my name is Yolanda Ohene, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the neuroimaging group of the University of Manchester. So just like a quick background of what I do is I did a PhD at UCL in London in medical imaging. And my work focuses on developing MRI techniques to look at the blood-brain barrier with kind of a focus on Alzheimer's disease. And so here today, I'm very much here in the capacity of being an early career researcher. And therefore, this talk will be through the lens of being a postdoc and my lived experiences working in academia. And I think inclusion and retention for early career researchers is really crucial to drive scientific discovery and innovation. And it's probably true that it's never been easy for early career researchers, but I think that in the current climate, it seems to be getting a lot harder. And so my kind of initial thought is about being an early career researcher is really like how to survive academia before even being able to think about how we can thrive. And so I actually saw a quote by the brilliant writer and activist Audre Lorde, which is kind of survival is not really an academic skill. And so I think that this is kind of a good way to kind of start thinking about how we can survive through the academic setting. And so to start off with, thinking about really the difficulties faced as early career researchers, there's many, and I think maybe the biggest one might be the temporary contract. So always thinking about what the next step is going to be, and that kind of feeds into the potentially moving locations, which makes it difficult to perhaps settle in places, and also kind of the advice as to whether you'll be better off in your career if you move to different institutions, or whether you'll be held back if you stay at the same place. And alongside this, there's the pressure to publish, as well as writing fellowships, teaching, and as well what we maybe hear less about is kind of the extended student debt, having having studied for a lot longer than people who go straight into industry or other careers. And this kind of has a bit of a knock-on effect. And one report from by the Wellcome Trust, which was undertaken by Shift in Learning, cited that a significant proportion of both junior and senior researchers believe that a career in research can be isolating and lonely. And so we all know that the hours can be long, and often this can be alone, and the job is kind of never done, which makes it hard to have, or it gives us extra effort to try to establish a good work-life balance. And I think that the knock-on effects of all of these aspects are really coming to the fore at the moment. And I read recently an article in Nature, which was kind of considering all of these difficulties, that there's really a lack of postdocs that are able to fill positions at the moment. And PIs are finding it kind of increasingly difficult to recruit postdocs into the lab. And of course, this is kind of a combination of many factors, including the structure of the academic system, economics, like career priorities. I think also thinking that maybe postdocs might, or various people working in academic sector might not feel particularly valued. And I think we really need to try to rethink the academic culture. And I think what's more, and kind of from my perspective, these problems are generally exacerbated for people from historically marginalised groups. So if we take the UK, for example, as that's where I'm based, there are 22,000 UK professors. And so I've noted this by putting 220 little people on the screen here. And what is quite a shocking figure that I think of is that less than 1% of these UK professors are Black. And so if we look graphically, this is what that would look like. And of course, this problem is exacerbated when thinking about the intersections of different identities. So Black women, for example, I think on the last count, there was 38 Black female professors in the UK, which I think there's probably more people watching this conference than there are Black women who are professors in the UK. And I think that that's quite a shocking figure. And people often say that there's a leaky pipeline, which kind of leads to this problem in a lack of diversity within the academic space. But I think it's really a broken pipeline, and I think at every stage of the way, it's more difficult for people from historically marginalised groups. And talking from this perspective of being a Black person, some figures show that it's actually Black researchers are really missing out on those funding, being awarded funding to move into more senior roles. And I think that this can become very disheartening for early career researchers, and especially those from historically marginalised groups and with intersecting identities. And me as a Black woman, I think there was many moments during my PhD where I felt, oh, sorry, I've slipped past there, felt kind of marginalised, and those times when you lack confidence, it can make it kind of disheartening to continue on a research path. But luckily enough, while I was doing my PhD, I did meet some other people, and a few people also from ethnic minority backgrounds who had similar feelings of we don't really see anyone like us in the higher in the more senior roles, and will we make it through our PhDs, and these kind of compounding factors. And that kind of led us to think about kind of coming together and supporting each other during our PhD. So what really helped me through the PhD was building networks as a early career researcher. And so in 2016, me and 3 other STEM people who worked in STEM fields came together to co-found the Minorities in STEM network. And so this was really to bring together those who worked in STEM fields who identify as being from an ethnic minority background, because we wanted to kind of connect people and also support each other and kind of raise the voices and use each other's platforms so more voices could be heard in the STEM fields. So initially when we started, there were a few different ways that we connected each other. First of all, it was an online network. So we used Twitter as our platform, and we had different people each week curating a Twitter page over kind of 3 years. And then also we had various different events. We launched the network at the Wellcome Trust, and we didn't know whether there would be other people across the UK who might be interested in the network, but we were actually really thrilled to find out that we only had 40 slots and they were all filled up rather quickly, and with lots of people with kind of similar and differing ideas of how we can lift up and support these different voices. And then after our initial event, we put together a Minorities in STEM symposium to bring together early career researchers across the UK in STEM fields. And then after that, because it was successful in bringing together a range of people from different disciplines, we were able to collaborate with the Francis Crick Institute to make a bigger and better symposium called Level Up Your Academic Toolkit. And so this brought together about 100 people across the UK who identify from ethnic minority backgrounds. And we, as well as discussing kind of some of the barriers that might be faced by people from ethnic minority backgrounds in STEM fields, we also wanted to include workshops to build on the various different skills that are needed to be an academic or work in scientific fields, including writing workshops to kind of strengthen our skills in writing, grants, fellowships, and also papers, which is so important for progressing in the field. And also we had workshops on communication, so thinking about speaking at conferences, to the general public, or in schools, or in the media, so talking about blogs or other media presentations. And so what did we learn from these different events? First of all, that these spaces and events for minoritized groups are really needed and necessary, because we didn't know whether they were needed. And I think that through the feedback from the participants who came along, one of the things that really stuck with me was there were so many people said that this was the first space where I felt that I was able to speak up and that I felt seen. And I think that that really says a lot to think about what are the spaces where maybe people from minoritized backgrounds don't feel seen and don't feel like their voice can be heard. Another thing that we learned was that collaborations with the larger organisations is really helpful, because of course they've got the funding and the kind of infrastructure to be able to put on these kind of events. And also in terms of kind of advertising and getting the word out and connecting people, it was very helpful. And also thinking about the remuneration of speakers and organisers for their time and expertise. I think when we're thinking about extracurriculum or equality, diversity and inclusion work, often this is kind of left to the people who need it the most, and it's kind of an additional job for people from these groups. And so I think that having remuneration or some recognition for putting these kind of activities together is really, really, really important. And also not forgetting that sometimes these spaces that go the extra mile to make people feel included, it often needs people to share their own lived experiences, which is sometimes quite a hard thing to do. And so really to recognise that, I think is important. And I think this goes in hand with support from people in senior positions, because again, quite often when we're thinking about making change, or we're thinking about kind of how to support people from different communities, it sometimes lands on the shoulder of those people who need support. And so those with senior positions make it a lot easier, and things can often be done a lot faster as well with having those in senior positions on board. And also grassroots initiatives are not really enough. I think both a top-down and bottom-up approach are really necessary for these types of events. Also, I wanted to highlight a further initiative that I'm a part of, which is the Blackett Lab family, which is the UK collective of Black physicists. And so this kind of came together in 2020, following the pandemic and also kind of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter protests. And so our aim is to kind of represent Black individuals who engage with physics. And so one way to do that is connecting people across the UK who have an interest and a passion for physics in the world, and then to look outwards to inspire others in these fields, and also thinking about how to inspire the Black community in physics and scientific research. So just to kind of think about how the different ways to support early career researchers. I mean, these few points that I'm going to bring up is of course not an extensive list, because I'm not an EDI expert. I'm merely a MRI physicist doing a postdoc. But I think some things that I think have been important for me to think about this year and for the future is, first of all, considering bridging fellowships. So I know that there's several different funding bodies who are really considering how to support people early in their career to get between the gaps, so that they won't be without a job and waiting for while they're writing fellowships, or while they need to get the last paper out to be able to write those fellowships. I think these bridging fellowships are really important, and I hope that more funding bodies will continue to kind of support them. Also, I think different institutions need to continue to have incentives for teaching. So when it's kind of unremunerated, I think that makes it very difficult for early career researchers to have an added burden onto their workload without any other incentive for doing this. And that goes, I think that kind of links to just general recognition from institutions that I think often early career researchers and postdocs in particular are really the workhorse of the innovative and new research, because those are the people who are in the positions to have the time to do the experiments, to implement the new the software and the sequences. And so getting some recognition, I think perhaps in the way of longer contracts. I think thinking about permanent contracts seems way out in the future. And I know that certainly in the UK over the last couple of weeks has been the UCU strikes, which are trying to kind of fight for like getting rid of this casualisation work. And then finally, just mental health awareness. And I think that kind of embedding this into the different research groups to make sure that people aren't getting burnt out, and to make sure that people are having sort of a well-balanced life between working in the academic sphere and being able to switch your laptop off and get involved with all of the hobbies and the extracurricular activities that I'm sure everyone has. And then sometimes it doesn't seem possible to balance everything. But I think it's really important that the mental health support is out there. So just there's one scheme that I'm a part of as part of the University of Manchester, which is called Prosper, and that's unlocking the postdoc career potential. And this is a one-year scheme, which I think it's been really useful for me, and I think that hopefully for the other people on the scheme it might be useful too. And so the Research Council, UKRI, has been able to fund 10% of our time to be able to help us to explore the next steps in our career. So whether that be a fellowship or whether that be actually moving to industry. But I think actually having the funding to be able to do that, and it's not just an additional part of your workload, I think that it's been really useful for myself. So academic or survival is not an academic skill, as the brilliant Audre Lorde said. And her quote goes on to say, it's learning how to stand alone, unpopular and sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. And I think that what's really important is this idea of how to make a common cause. And I think that we certainly need to work together to be able to support and push up the early career researchers. And I think especially senior academics play a big role in supporting, connecting and advocating for early career researchers, and to help to change this research culture, which sometimes, and in this current climate, doesn't seem possible to thrive. So that's all from me, and I'm happy to take any questions or to continue this discussion if you have any. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic, and I think highlights a number of really important issues here for early career researchers. So really glad that people that you're able to communicate this to the group here. So it does look like we have a couple questions, so we're running a bit behind, but let's take these questions that we have. And if Sophie is still here, I can invite you to the stage, but it looks like the first question I think was for Shern. Let's see. I don't know which stage I invite her to, I guess here. Do this. And what do you think the correct balance is between teaching academics good software engineering skills and hiring dedicated RSEs? And I think this in some ways ties into the last talk we heard, because there could be avenues for retention through developing people into things like SRE roles, where you're kind of, growing the availability of roles in academia may also provide some opportunities for that.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I think you expanded on my question very well there, and I'd be very curious to hear what Shern has to say.
Firstly, I just want to say I really loved Yolanda's talk, and I think it really at least some of the issues, not all of them, do overlap. In terms of the correct balance between teaching academics good software engineering skills and hiring dedicated RSEs, I think top of mind, I think it's really useful for all academics to at least understand the motivation for some of these skills, like things like helping everyone to be more aware of things like the reproducibility crisis, how you can version control your data, the fact that with the tools that we have today, it is possible. We would like to make it easy, but it's at least possible to get to a point where your data can be quickly reproduced and shared. And I had the feeling that at least partly there's a motivational problem where science has so-called gotten along fine with less of these software engineering skills up to now. And I think the other point, the end of the education, is at the undergraduate level, where it would be nice to again get students to think about reproducibility in the same way that they think about, for example, how important it is to cite the work that they have, or how important it is to run experiments in triplicate. It would be good if we could sneak reproducibility somewhere in there. And I have a feeling sometimes that it's really more a question of at least generating the demand, and then where academics can see that RSEs do have something to contribute, then I think naturally there will be institutions will then be able to sort of figure out, do we want to invest more into, let's say, ECR seminars for RSE skills, or do we want to actually hire an RSE, or some combination of both? I feel like sort of the motivational aspect is what we need to work on first. But that's just me. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
You're muted, Ashley.
Sorry. Yeah, it looks like we have 2 or 3 for Yolanda. I think I just accidentally dismissed 2 of them that came from Mo, actually. So maybe you can speak to that. I think there's some overlap with this one as well. The last one looks like it's looking for a little bit of practical advice for people who are considering postdoc positions right now, what they can look for, sort of concrete elements. And Mo, maybe you can expand on the other ones that I accidentally erased from the screen.
No worries. I was just curious. I mean, that was a really great talk and great insights into what the barriers are for retention and inclusion of early career researchers, especially the researchers from minorities, different kinds of minorities. But I was curious to know, from your view and from your experiences, what is the main reason behind that, and what's the main barrier behind that? Is it the regulations, I mean, in the national level, or is it more changing the attitude in the scientific community itself? So are the regulations there, and there's a need to change in the attitude, or is it more the need to change it from the top?
So I think in terms of like some of the barriers, I think a huge one is salary, and the kind of like the difference between like being an academic and going into industry. So I think, I mean, this is just my opinion, like this is just my opinion, but I think that because there's so few people from let's just say ethnic, or let's just say Black women in STEM, then actually the opportunities that you get in academia, if you think that actually the salary is going to be lower, then also there's not the diversity in these fields is also low, and therefore perhaps you might expect the support not to be there. So if you weigh the different aspects up, I think that academia is often sort of like put a little bit on a pedestal, and it's kind of, a lot of people do it because they're really passionate about the subject, which is brilliant. But then also I think the prestige is part of it, but I suppose the prestige doesn't pay your gas bills, and so I think that that's kind of one of the aspects that I always think that it's a bit the kind of the perception of kind of the salaries of of postdocs or of academics in general. I think it's thought to be a lot higher than it actually is. So practically, if you're considering what are the benefits that I'm getting from being in this field, I think it's fairly low in the academic space. And because there's not so many like moving through, let's say from historically minoritized backgrounds, I think that makes it difficult. I mean, I think there's a whole host of other reasons as well, but that's the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a huge element of it. It's sad to have to point to money immediately as one of the things, but I think it's true. And you know, people that come from backgrounds that can afford to take a low salary for a number of years, or extra student debt, or not have student debt, allows them to take those opportunities, where I think that obviously edges other people out who don't have the same type of privilege. So that's definitely a great point. The other thing I'd like to point out, I really liked how you described it as a broken pipeline, because I think in particular in industry, people point to it as a pipeline problem as a way to sort of pass the buck. One thing that's unique about academia is that academia is the pipeline. So sort of like, it's one thing for industry to say, oh, it's the problem of all the colleges and universities that are training these people, and it's their issue to solve. But academia, it is the pipeline itself. So yeah, it's very apt, I think, to call it a broken pipeline.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, I think we need to put that. We're running way behind here. But thank you very much to our first two speakers, and we will move on to the next one, Russ Poldrack, who is from Stanford University, and we'll discuss building a culture of open science. We cannot hear you right now, or I can't.
How is that for sound? That's working? Okay, cool.
Gotcha now. Thank you.
All right. So thanks for the invitation. This is a really great conference, and I'm happy to be part of this. So I want to talk about how we can go about trying to, make change in the sort of culture that exists in science. So just as background, I'm a professor at Stanford. I've been doing fMRI research for about 25 years. So I've seen a lot of the ways in which things can go wrong in academia, and I've spent roughly the last decade trying to work on kind of issues around reproducibility, and ultimately I think it comes down to culture. And so, what do we mean by culture? Well, one way to think about culture is what are the norms and principles and practices that an institution has. But I like this quote from this business writer, Jacob Engel: "Culture is created by the behaviors you tolerate." And so, let's think about some of the types of behaviors that have been tolerated in the past, right? So if you think about what I might call closed science lab culture, one is a competitive atmosphere. There's a story about one particular lab where new postdocs show up, and they get a desk in this room that's called the loser room, cramped room, no windows. And the only way to get out of the loser room is to publish a paper in Science or Nature or Cell, and then you get moved into one of the nice offices. But it's zero sum, so whoever hasn't published a Science or Nature or Cell paper recently, they get moved back into the loser room. So yeah, not exactly conducive to quality of life or mental health. A high level of secrecy or paranoia. I have seen lab members from one lab being forbidden to talk to members of another lab located in the same building that studies the same problem because they're too paranoid about ideas being stolen. Pressure to find specific results. I recently heard of someone, a postdoc, being threatened with being fired and losing their visa status if they didn't find a result consistent with their PI's hypothesis by trying a few more analyses. Lack of trust. I know someone who was scooped by their postdoc advisor, who basically went behind their back and did the same experiment with somebody else and published it before they were able to publish it. These are all the kind of things that have happened historically in science that have made, and obviously there's a lot of labs who've not done this in the past, but these are the kind of things that are tolerated in science, right? And that in some ways defines our culture. So what's the culture we want, right? Well, we want openness and transparency. We want to be able to go talk about our research with anybody, be able to share all of our code and our data openly. A collaborative atmosphere. We want people to be, able to collaborate with anybody who they think could be useful in kind of helping them solve their problem. And trust. We want to be able to trust that each of us has each other's best interest in mind, and that we're all in this to try to solve scientific problems and not to, to sort of aggrandize ourselves. So how do we get there? This is a figure from the Center for Open Science's strategy for culture change, which I like, because it lays out all the different things that sort of have to happen to change culture. Starting with infrastructure that makes it possible for people to do the right thing, up through and building that stuff well to make it easy, making it normative by having communities that enforce norms, having it rewarding by by being sort of aligned with the incentives, and ultimately having it be required by being built into policy. The one thing I think I would change about this is this is another, sorry for all the business writer quotes tonight, or this morning, or whatever time it is where you are. A quote by another business writer: incentives drive behavior and behavior spawns culture. So the idea is that, the reason that we do what we do is almost always because of incentives. And, in the end, if we follow the incentives, that's going to drive our culture. And so we have to figure out, how do we change the incentives to get people to behave in the way that reflect ultimately the values that we want to have instantiated in science. And so aligning the incentives sounds like it should be easy. It turns out to be very hard, right? So people should be rewarded for doing the right thing. Right now they're not, right? But they should be. Why isn't that? Well, think about who's making the decisions, right? Who's making decisions about hiring and tenure and funding? They're mostly people of my vintage and older who, got their jobs by doing all the kind of science that we're now saying, is problematic, and by, living a culture that we think is problematic. And so, convincing people to change midway through their life and renounce the way that they used to live is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Nonetheless, I think that there's work going on right now that's actually, potentially going to be able to make this change. I'm going to mention in a moment this group called Helios. This is a figure that the Helios group created that outlines what they call mutually reinforcing vectors for change. And the idea is that if we want to make change, and in particular, this is focused on change and how people are hired and promoted and tenured in academia. We need all of these different angles to sort of come together to mutually reinforce one another. And obviously some are going to be necessary, others might not be necessary, but still are going to be very important. But ultimately we need all these things to kind of come together. So fortunately, across the world, organizations and particularly governmental and non-governmental organizations are starting to really push hard in favor of open science. And so, in the U.S., the White House just recently put out a guidance basically saying that all federally funded research needs to be made freely available. That includes publications and data. Our space agency, NASA, is basically saying they want to transform to open science over the next decade. Similarly, the G7, UNESCO, a number of other groups around the world are also pushing to make open science the default for how we do science. And so Helios is a group within the US that basically is bringing together leadership from many different universities. I think there's over 100 colleges and universities now involved, basically trying to figure out how we can successfully change the way that people are hired and tenured or promoted to center open scholarship, because we want this to be beyond just science, right? Any sort of scholarship should be open. And so, presidents, including, the president of Stanford, made commitments. And, we're basically working now to figure out how do we actually go about make this change. So the point of this is that, presidents from a large number of universities have signed on to doing this, evincing some degree, at least, of commitment to thinking that this is an important point. But that's obviously going to take a long time. Like, if that happens in 5 years, if that effort is successful in 5 years, we'll be really lucky. So what can we do in the meantime? And I want to just briefly walk through 2 case studies about how we've tried to or are trying to make change in the scientific culture towards openness and reproducibility. And the first is around changing norms about errors. So science is done by humans. I don't think ChatGPT is quite ready to take over our jobs just yet. And we know that no human enterprise is free from errors, right? In fact, if you look at professional software developers, they make anywhere from 1 to 50 errors per 1,000 lines of code, right? And most of us who are writing software, other than the research software engineers here who are professionals, most of us are kind of serving as amateur software engineers, and we're almost certainly making a lot more errors than that. And unfortunately, errors, when they get uncovered, are often viewed as either signs of incompetence or sometimes even fraud, when they're mostly probably human error. And instead, I think we need to reframe how we think about errors as teachable moments. And so I kind of started doing this a while ago. I wrote a blog post back in 2013 that basically walked through an error that I had made in some code. I was writing a paper, was analyzing some data, and basically had an error that wasn't obvious. It didn't sort of completely change things, and but it changed the numbers enough to matter, and I hadn't seen it. One of my a grad student I was working with noticed it when they were reviewing the code, and in the blog post I sort of walk through some of the issues around how we think about errors. I want to highlight a paper that we just recently read in my lab that I think does a really nice job of kind of talking through how to think about this issue. This is this paper called Error Tight by Julia Strand, and you can find it on SciArchive. If you just and I also wrote a blog post about it recently, so if you go to my blog, you can find it there. But Julia lays out a number of sort of ways to move beyond this kind of like blame and shame model for errors to thinking about kind of a system level analysis. And I think she mentions this thing that I find like a really useful model for thinking about the direction that we want to go. It's something that's done in academic medicine called a morbidity and mortality conference. So this is basically a conference where all of the medical staff get together, doctors, nurses, others, and talk about either bad outcomes, somebody died, somebody was some sort of permanently injured, or sort of near misses, things where somebody almost died. And the point, and this is a point that Julia sort of really hammers in that paper, is that the goal is to focus on the system, right? It's kind of a blame-free zone, right? But the question is like, what about the system might have led to this error, and how might the system have been different in a way that would have prevented the error? So we brought this to bear a couple of years ago when another error in some code that we had put out was found. So we had posted a preprint that laid out some issues with some of the behavioral data from this particular large brain imaging study. And we'd also made available the code. The data are already available. And the team from the ABCD study took our code and sort of dug into it and ultimately found that we had made an error. This is an excerpt from a blog post that we wrote, this coding error postmortem blog post that I wrote with the other researchers on the project. Basically, they showed that we made an error in the code and that it resulted in an inaccurate estimate of one of the particular measures that we were using. Fortunately, because we had put out the preprint and the code, this error was able to we were able to fix this error while the paper was still under review. We're able to basically write the editor and say, hey, this team identified an error in our code. Here's a revised version of the paper that fixes the error. It didn't fundamentally change the conclusion of the paper. The paper ended up being published in eLife, and we were actually able to thank Sage and Hugh and the others for identifying that error. And so I think that this is an example of how we can think about kind of a virtuous cycle around errors, right? And it's hard when somebody says, hey, you made an error. It's difficult to not take that personally. But I think that we have to move beyond that and really view this as something where we're all trying to find the right answer. And if we got it wrong, the goal should be to fix it, not to sort of be defensive. One of the things that we did that's done in the morbidity and mortality conference is what's called a root cause analysis, which is basically trying to ask, like, why did this error happen? And we, in talking through our particular error, we found two things, right? One was a flawed code review process. Like, we do code reviews, but the person who had reviewed the code was so focused on the statistical analysis stuff that they didn't properly review the pre-processing code, which is where the error had actually occurred. But I think the more important thing that we identified here was time pressure. We were really pushing to get this work out quickly. And, in psychology, we have this thing we know as a speed accuracy trade-off, right? When you go faster, you make more errors. And that's exactly what happened to us. We weren't as focused on accuracy as we should have been. And that kind of drove us to not, potentially do the level of checking that we should have. All right, so I'm going to talk about one other case study, which is around collaboration between labs. And this idea of kind of, sharing infrastructure has already been mentioned in one of the earlier talks. But this came out of, being one of a number of labs that are developing tools for neuroimaging data analysis, and finding that, each of the different groups was basically writing, modules to solve the same problems and duplicating effort. But none of us felt we could just take the other team's modules and run with them because, we all have different standards for how we write code, how we test things, and so on. And so a group of us basically decided that we could reduce a lot of wasted time and effort by working together. So we've developed a group called InMind, which stands for Never Mind, This Method Is Not Duplicated. This is being really spearheaded by Greg Keir from the Child Mind Institute, collaborating with Ted Satterthwaite, Damien Fair, Satya Ghosh, and Mike Millen, along with a number of others who have now joined the group. And the idea is to basically come up with a set of procedures and methods for basically creating and testing and benchmarking software, and ultimately, disseminating software and documenting software in ways that make it easy for any group that wants to buy into this to feel comfortable using the code that's being written by the other groups. So the idea is that, we want to have consistent testing and benchmarking, and consistent terminology, consistent documentation, all these sorts of things that we think are going to allow us to to basically make software development for science much more efficient. And so if you want to know more about that, we have a white paper that that will be out in preprint soon. I think it's actually available from the website right now. Inmind.org is the website. And I think with that, I just want to conclude by highlighting that we all have to work to ultimately change the incentive structures in science, but we should all try to do whatever we can now to try to start driving those behaviors that are ultimately going to give rise to that culture. And with that, I am done.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. That was really a lot of interesting stuff. And it's cool to see, like you mentioned, a lot of those things coming from top down, which I think harkens back to some of the talks before. So it's great. Very encouraging to see that stuff happening. Again, we're going to move on to the next talk and then save discussion and questions for a break after that. So the next one is by Sergei Obruchkov from Resonant in New Zealand, who will be talking about accessible MRI devices for education.
Can you guys see my screen? Can I see a thumbs up? Sir, can you guys see my screen? Yeah, a thumbs up.
I see your screen, but no slides yet.
There we go. So just a little ad. If you have a chance to join us at ISMRM in Toronto in 2023, please join us at the campfire for a historical put together by Historical Archives for dedicated to Paul Callahan. Yeah, so thank you to the speakers for inviting us. And my name is Sergei Obruchkov. I'm co-founder of Resonant Limited and a senior engineer at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. We're going to have a 1 foot in the academia and 1 foot in the industry. So the Resonant Limited was founded in 2019 by a small group of engineers and physicists. We set ourselves with a bit of a mission to create open and accessible products that can enable the growth of MR technologies worldwide. And it's the next generation of MRI experts. So we're based out of New Zealand and out of the same lab run by Paul Callahan. He was an inspiring scientist, a teacher and a mentor, and a leader as well too, and a pretty prominent figure here in New Zealand. As he was passionate about education, one of the first MRI systems that was dedicated specifically for educational segment was called Terra Nova. It was based on the Earth field magnet systems, and he was able to take it down to Antarctica and do all kinds of science on it. So we wanted to follow up on the first product and make something that kind of resonates more with the newer generation and is easier to use and takes advantage of open source software and all kinds of other advances that technology has offered us. Leveraging electronic hardware and make a compact educational MRI system. And especially the manufacturing technologies and methodologies were absolutely crucial for us to make a device that's compact and cost effective. So, thinking of the speakers, the topics, so we're talking about the open science, incentives for open science, and I was just kind of thinking how I can address this in my talk. So I'd like to kind of address two questions. It's usually more than enough for a 20-minute talk. The first question is really, what's it like to create a open source software MRI platform? Why do it? And who we did it for? And the second one is, if we're engineers and think that engineers are building tools to fix problems, that's how we are wired. Can building a tool fix a problem? And can incentivize an open and transparent science. It's always good to talk in stories, and in our case, we have a protagonist who's a early career researcher. They used an MRI system quite a lot, probably during their PhD. Learned about MRI most likely from at least 3 very thick textbooks. If it feels like you, apologies. And a good chance they had experience using and seeing an MRI in action. They spent probably more time sleeping in MRI, being a normal subject, than they would like to admit as well too. And after graduating, a few postdocs, positions, they might have been able to find a position somewhere that will now have access to a research MRI system, they do not grow on trees, so it's kind of a fleeting resource. So they're really limited to what they can do without losing that access to that technology. So from a teaching perspective, they kind of are resorted to teaching and lecturing theoretical concepts only, and doing a lot of image and data processing on the data sets that are available. And as far as research is concerned, well, it's kind of really hard to get it's a steep barrier entry into research MRI system to kind of buy for any university that you're working with if they don't have one, or there's competing elements associated with that, and sometimes actually you have to use a clinical only scanner that's limits their ability of having a sample size or actually how much what they can do with the system. And if you think about it, the data science field is growing really fast at a quite a almost exponential rate. The barrier for entry and on that front is very low. The tools are available. Most of them are open source, and the limiting growth rate really, I think, is the availability of GPUs and that you own or rent to run a study. So what we want to do is we feel that technology trends are really kind of starting to lower the barriers of entry to hardware, things like a Raspberry Pi and Arduino. But it has been relatively slow to affect the MRI world. So we want to leverage these developments and build more flexible hardware at a lower cost. If you're in an engineering department, you might be familiar with some really expensive benchtop instrumentation. That usually costs tens and tens of thousands of dollars, and they're often built for one purpose only. So as far as teaching students on these instrumentations, actually, it's quite difficult. You often cannot have a lab full, a bench full of this equipment, so you're kind of resorted to having one or two or teach only a certain portion of the course around it. And the engineering kind of have solved this problem by building all kinds of low-cost devices, PC-based oscilloscopes, or there is a new technology that actually coming up right now called a software reconfigurable instrumentation. So two examples or three examples here are RedPetile, which is this device here, my Leo by National Instruments, and the analog Discovery 2 by Digital Devices. So what actually is really interesting about them is that they share something in common. They're all under $2,000 or $3,000, and you can essentially kind of some of them are much less, and you can have a bench full of these devices, and students can actually take them with them. They are allowed to tinker with them to their satisfaction, understand what's going on, and take them home essentially. So what enables this is the new technology that's enabling this is a system on chip. So one of the manufacturers of this is Xilinx, and it's what it really is a CPU surrounded by a reprogrammable logic. And picking up these devices is fairly it's not for everybody. It's not really designed for amateur electronic enthusiasts at the moment. And Xilinx, as a company, sees that as an issue. So what they actually have done is they have been creating an ecosystem based on open source software to enable anybody to start picking it up and develop signal processing and learn how to use these system-on-chip devices fairly easily without need to know actually about the FPGA or real-time language toolchains. So the combination of hardware and open source software enables them to enables the hardware designers to who want their designs to be used by the widest possible audience to actually be able to pick it up and do whatever they want with it. So Xilinx sees this as an opportunity and push the open source tools to enable audience to pick them up and use them. So the other advantage and more exciting part is that open source is actually enables people to build communities. And if you go to the Pink website, Pink.io, there's going to be a whole bunch of community projects that you can purchase the hardware, and they're done by different academic institutions to teach various aspects of signal processing, video, data editing, or pretty much anything that you can do with these devices, processing, audio processing, and anybody can essentially download a Python notebook. Everything's done in Python. They can apply to their hardware and start interacting with it. Right. So the Illumer version, our first hardware iteration essentially started by a PhD project by John Zen. So it's a very small, compact electronics MR console that was let's see, that was based on this system on chip module, and you just guys saw the 3 electronics boards that were integrated with the MR sensor. So when we started using it and kind of developing, breathing life into it using software, I actually found it very, very difficult. It was quite complicated to use and write your own software from scratch. Just a mishmash of all kinds of different codes, and making it easily and user-friendly was actually quite complicated. This is where the open source software kind of really can speed up the development of flexible hardware. So one of the advantages of using a system-on-chip platform is that Illumer, that's our open source device, is built on essentially Xilinx Sync digital platform. It has a real-time pulse sequence control and signal processing. It's all accomplished in programmable logic inside the Zinc system on chip, and it really minimizes the required custom hardware that was needed to build. So what really is, if the software is a really makes a lot of make the world go around right now, the push forward technological trends is that to actually make the software reprogram hardware now is essentially kind of the future. And we tied everything together using a bunch of open source tools. So we chose to use a user interface based on JupyterLab. It can run on pretty much any browser with 0 installation required, and it all runs on the on Linux operating system inside the system on module that's inside our device. So processes the data, visualizes, and displays it to the user interface through a bokeh and panel. And even the hardware pulse sequences are now fully programmable in Python as well too. In order to make the device as compact as possible, we have really leveraged the manufacturing technologies. So most of the device is 3D printed. It makes things for us to be cost effective as possible. especially when we're trying to produce them in small numbers. We can make complicated parts, and depending on the materials you choose for the 3D printing, you can make them strong and durable as well for, as an end product. So by putting everything together, we resulted in producing a small portable MRI system. It's designed for with the philosophy that students can now have a user interface, which is easily accessible through a familiar environment using Jupyter Lab. And if they want to dive into any code, everything is written in Python. So the Python notebooks are essentially going to drive the signal acquisition and data visualization and processing as well too. So our vision with this tool is to kind of foster a community that shares MRI development projects. So things like pulse sequences, data processing, visualizations, and phantoms can be uploaded into to online shared platform. And so the things we can do with our device is essentially things like a 4-dimensional flow, diffusion weighted imaging, fat water, or diffusion, even diffusion tensor imaging as well too. So as we're building these tools, we actually realized that MRI device can be used in quite a lot of and interdisciplinary as well too, for engineering, physics, and biology labs as well too. And the bore size is not, let's say the device itself is about 8 kilos only. So it's very small and compact, and you can essentially take it with you, put it in the plane if you want to. So we actually fly with the device as well too. A repository of projects based on Jupyter notebooks with methods and data can be shared, as well as the pulse sequences. The academics are usually quite busy, so being able to share teaching lab resources such as lab scripts and experimental setups, or how to build a certain phantom for a certain data acquisition, even 3D CAD models can be shared as well too. And the exciting part as well too for me was that the Illumina device we can take it out as a for outreach projects. So you can take it and take it out to high schools or other classrooms. I went pretty fast, but yeah, in summary, just kind of wanted to say, what's it like to create a platform for open source software? Well, by leveraging large and stable open source communities like Jupyter Lab and Python and Linux, it definitely helped us reduce the time to market and fasten the pace of innovation. Choosing Jupyter Lab and Python, just it's the new tools of the next generation that customers know and are familiar with these tools. So it's easier for them to pick up and start using. Sometimes it's very difficult to delineate where open source starts and where your kind of hardware have to start as well too, and and being able to pick up a Xilinx Ping project essentially kind of helped us to help us focus and adhere to kind of good design and architecture principles. And because a speaker before me have pointed out that software is now the new differentiator, and being able to see that it's actually being pushed to the hardware level is it's almost natural progression. It's a pretty exciting one as well too. And as far as the building community is concerned, it's kind of actually fun and more exciting to talk about a vision than a product, as it attracts like-minded customers that are willing to share back and contribute back to the community. And as well too, as a company, taking using the open source tools, it's almost natural to kind of contribute back. So some of the in-house modifications and developments of Jupyter Lab extensions were fed back into the larger repository. So a bit of a more complicated question about, does building tools for education incentivize open and open science? Well, there's a few speakers have pointed out that having accessible tools in front of you can help with reinforced learning. So it actually, we see that it closes the loop between the theory and practice. And the most important thing as well, too, it actually permits you to make mistakes. So sometimes you don't want to have a clinical MRI system or a research system to be broken, right? It's going to get very costly. So putting that system out of action for a while. And the thing that I think is most important is having a system that is essentially an open box. It kind of sets expectations for researchers as well, too, to be able to jump to any part of the code, open it up, look at it, and you're going to be more likely to like work in that environment and want to propagate that type of work as well, too. So I try to minimize as many black boxes as possible is good for science and learning in general. Being able to develop and debug pulse sequences on a physical device is always good as well, too. And one of the more fun things that I have actually done with the device is being able to take it into the community, which is pretty much impossible to do with a big MRI system. So we find that it's it can increase your engagement with the community and explain to people what the systems and how MRI actually works, and increases the transparency as well, too, of the science that you do. So I went a little bit too fast, but I just want to thank everybody for listening. Cheers.
Awesome. That thing looks really cool. I'm like picturing the little, I kind of want one on my desk. Those images are really fun. So. Excellent. I would also point out at the end, you mentioned building a community, and I know a few other speakers, even earlier in the session, mentioned networking and building a community. I feel like if anytime you see the word community, you should pursue that as a potential area for building in your network, and open source can be one place to do that. Sometimes intimidating, some projects are better than others for it, but just point that out. Okay, let's look at some questions here. There's one that has several upvotes here. It looks like it's targeted towards Russ about the EnMind project, which sounds very exciting. What was it like getting all the stakeholders, especially the more senior scientists, to buy into the project?
It's interesting. It took no work at all. In fact, it was this was really the brainchild of a number of senior people. I kind of came along after they had sort of put together the idea, but Mike Millam, Ted Satterthwaite, Damien Fair, I think it was really driven by sort of seeing the challenges and the waste that was going into all the work that each of our teams was doing. Trying to build. So we've been. We have this workflow called fMRI Prep, which is a kind of a large, kind of robust workflow for functional MRI pre-processing, and then other groups wanted to build other sort of preps. Ted's group is building ASL prep. Mike Millam's group is actually, they have a different framework for developing workflows, and they were actually doing work to try to compare how theirs worked to ours. And there was just this big realization that there was a lot of duplication that didn't need to happen, and that the only way to get around it was to basically have processes that would allow us to all feel comfortable, like taking a module that somebody else had written and just using it, because we knew that it would live up to the testing standards that each of our groups had if we have the same testing standards. So. And then the hard part has really been kind of coming up with all those standards, and that's the PIs haven't been doing that work for the most part. It's been the software engineers in each of our groups working together to kind of figure out what it would take for them to be able to to go back and forth, and that's so really the project is kind of a testament to the work that they've put in.
Yeah, that's really cool. I really like the framing of the project as reducing duplicate work, because I think that's something that's very hard for people to kind of disagree with, that sort of mission. So excellent. Questions here. This one, I think, let's see. Oh yeah, there is one here for Sergei. Let's see. How difficult do you find the process of taking an open tool to market? And what about the market dynamics of an open tool?
Yeah, that's a good question, though. So the most difficult part really is trying to figure out how do you delineate and where do you stop. How deep do you go in open source, right? So do you open source the entire hardware, right? And at some point, you're going to have to kind of have a line drawn and say, okay, we want to be able to keep control of the hardware, because it's actually going to be easier for us to maintain it and build it. Source parts for it when they are not in stock as well too, as the certain things kind of go out. You don't have to redesign it. You just kind of you know your hardware, so you can get a new part for it. And yeah, so we're kind of really focusing on the magnet itself as a platform, as the device, right? So this is what we're selling as a product, is actually a turnkey solution for those that actually want to pick it up and start using it. We're also thinking about opening certain aspects of the device, so things like preamplifiers and some duplexers or some other components that you cannot buy elsewhere, and some hobbyists essentially want to build their own MRI system, would like to pick up and use. We're happy to kind of actually manufacture and sell them. And we can open the designs as well too for those parts. But honestly, it's much easier for somebody to just go and pick it up and buy it and start using it. I know from academic perspective, that's exactly what we'd rather do anyways. And as far as the market dynamics is concerned, so this is the most interesting thing about academia and versus industry. Talking to a lot of industry people who actually left academia into industry, is they're always surprised how friendly and open the competing companies are between each other. Sometimes it doesn't happen with the academics. And the reason for it, I was explained, it was that it really is kind of like, it is a community. There is only so many MRI companies that you can go for. It is potentially your next job move. And in academia, you can actually be a little bit more, point your elbows if you wanted to, without too much progression. So that's kind of an interesting dynamics there. Hope that answers that.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think there's a lot of, we're seeing more and more, at least in the software space, of these kind of open core companies, and where you maybe have an open source product at the sort of center, and then there's some, software as a service or something is kind of the current in fashion model for software itself. But I think also having some type of hardware product you can sell, even if that hardware is, open itself, that can be appealing to researchers, but you're saving them a step of having to buy the separate pieces and put them together or something like that. So yeah, really cool. Well, I really want to thank everybody, especially all our speakers, but also all the attendees for spending this time with us. I think this has been a really fantastic session to open MRI together. I'm looking forward to a lot of other really great sessions. I want to let people go because we're way over time, but thanks again really for sticking around. I think there are sessions every 5 hours, someone mentioned. I read that somewhere. So go have a snack, take a nap, and see you back here. Thanks, everybody.